record this. Today, the goal is to understand what happens in how we allocate manufacturing overhead costs. Now, unlike raw materials, it takes this much sugar to make this much soda, and it takes this much labor to build a fire truck. You can't do that with manufacturing overhead costs. You can't assign it per job. We actually need to look at it as a whole. And what I mean is as a whole period. This particular year, this is how much our overhead was to produce what we produced. So again, manufacturing overhead is a little bit of a different animal because we can't assign it to specific jobs with any specificity, knowing actually what it costs. Instead, what we create is something called a predetermined overhead rate, and that's how we allocate manufacturing overhead costs to each of the jobs. And that's what this part of the chapter introduces you to. Okay, a predetermined overhead rate is is estimated and created at the very beginning. So as jobs get done, they know basically how much manufacturing overhead cost should be added to that job's total cost. Okay, so predetermined overhead rate is usually expressed based on a certain activity, and so they would say that our overhead is going to be 75% of our labor costs, right? Or our overhead is going to be, a certain percentage of the machine hours or some other measure. This is basically how they allocate overhead. Okay, they base the predetermined overhead rate usually as a percentage of some activity that they are doing in the process of creating their products. And that's basically what we're going to be looking at today. This is something that has to be established at the beginning of the year because they are, again, they need to estimate how much overhead costs are going to be for the year. And that's how they start determining how to allocate overhead to each job. Depending on the size of the company, whether the company's very large or very small, they might use a single predetermined overhead rate, or they might actually have several rates for different departments to use when they allocate overhead based on their job, the job that they're doing. So illustration 2.9 in your book, which is on page, what page is 57? Yeah, bottom of page 57. Will show you the formula for computing the predetermined overhead rate that companies use. They estimate the total amount of overhead costs that they think they're going to spend for the year in production. They divide that by the operating activity. Okay, and again, that operating activity could be labor, could be machine hours, and that's how they determine what the rate is. Once they determine what the rate is, now they can start assigning manufacturing overhead to each of the jobs that they do. Remember, we're still in job order costing, and so overhead has to be allocated. Okay, so this is on page 58. Okay, manufacturing overhead, as you know, very much like raw materials and direct labor, are part of the manufacturing process, right? They're directly related to the products that are being created. But manufacturing overhead costs need to be first assigned to work in process, right? And so how do they actually assign the costs to the work in process account for jobs that are going on? Well, they actually look at the activity base that they are using. That could be, again, labor costs or something like this. They multiply it by the actual predetermined overhead rate, and then that's how overhead is assigned to each of the particular jobs. Okay, and you're going to see an example of this play out, and your homework on this part of the chapter will be based on this example. Okay, so here is where we need to start paying attention for our reference on how to do this. So, and this, by the way, is on page 58 in your book, if you have your book with you. So Wallace Company, they use direct labor cost as their activity base. They're assuming that the annual overhead costs for this year will be $280,000. That's the overhead costs for the year. And direct labor costs for that year are expected to be $350,000. So the predetermined overhead rate is simply the ratio of these numbers. So as you see, or do you see, the $280,000 is the overhead. That's the estimated overhead costs. When you compare that to total total direct labor costs, the overhead rate is 80%. Okay, so basically for every dollar they spend on labor for a particular job that's done, they're going to allocate manufacturing overhead at 80% of that number. Okay, so 80 cents on the dollar will be basically how they allocate manufacturing overhead to a job in this system. Okay, so this is a very important example. Here we go. Here's another illustration on how this works. So here we have Wallace. As you know, Wallace Company applies manufacturing overhead based on direct labor costs. So what is going to be the applied overhead if the direct labor costs are $28,000? Now remember, we just did the predetermined overhead rate for Wallace, right? For every dollar they spend on labor, they allocate 80 cents worth of that as overhead. Okay. So $28,000 of labor costs would correspond to $22,400 of overhead, manufacturing overhead costs for a specific job, okay, because it's 80%. The entries, yes, the journal is fun. Right? The entries would show that because we have allocated $22,400 of applied overhead, or we've estimated $22,400 of manufacturing overhead is going to be used because it's 80% of direct labor costs, we're going to move the $22,400 out of manufacturing overhead account and put it into the work in process account for inventory. And so that's what you see here. This particular entry simply increases our work in process inventory by $22,400 and lowers the manufacturing overhead by $22,400. This is what you'll be doing in terms of the journal entry here. How it looks in the bigger picture, and this is on the next page, 59, is now that we have assigned $22,400 in total overhead costs, we have to assign them to specific jobs. Okay. And so, again, it's relatively simple to figure out. Direct manufacturing overhead is 80% of direct labor costs. Okay. So if your direct labor cost for job 101 was $9,000, 80% of that number, which is $7,200, represents the manufacturing overhead for that job on that day. At the bottom of the job number 101 on the end of the month, we allocated $6,000 of direct labor for this job. 80% of that is $4,800, and that's going to be your manufacturing overhead. So this is how we would allocate manufacturing overhead based on this overhead rate. Okay, I hope everyone sees that. Direct labor for job 1 is $15,000. So you'll see the manufacturing overhead based on the predetermined overhead rate is 80% of that, which is $12,000. Please pay attention. Drugs are bad. So for job 102, as you see, same thing, manufacturing overhead is 80% of the direct labor costs. So if on the 15th we did $4,000 worth of direct labor for job 102, 80% of that would be allocated to manufacturing overhead on the same day, because the predetermined overhead rate dictates, in this case, 80% of our labor costs are how we allocate manufacturing overhead. Toward the end of the month, we did another $5,000 worth of work on job 102. So we allocated 80% of that, which is $4,000 for manufacturing overhead. Direct labor was $9,000 for job 102. Manufacturing overhead was 80% of that, $7,200. Okay. So how do you feel about this in general? Do I get any thumbs up, thumbs down? Any other fingers that you want to use? Okay, that makes sense. We're looking good. Okay. So if this makes sense, this is really much of what you're doing here. This is great. Notice, by the way, I'll go back to this. Your total work in process inventory would be, the total on the debit side for raw materials and labor and overhead. It's allocated accordingly. So job 101, if you spent $12,000 on direct materials, $15,000 in direct labor, and $12,000 of manufacturing overhead, job 101 cost you $39,000 to do. And that $39,000 spent on job 101 gave you 1,000 units. Yes, yes? If you spent on job 102, if you spent 7,000 on direct materials, 9,000 on labor, and 7,200 on overhead, your total cost for job 102 was $23,200, and that created 1,500 units for whatever this job was for. And you would read job 103 the same. Total materials, total labor, total manufacturing. Of course, manufacturing is 80% of labor, right? The total amount of costs for job 103, and it provided you with so many units. So if you actually allocate, if you look at the amount of work in process inventory, these three numbers for materials, labor, and overhead have been distributed through the job cost sheets. So the total amount of the job cost sheets should likely equal work in process inventory. So the next slide basically shows you that the total amount of that you allocated to work in process has been allocated properly to your job cost sheets. because that's what we've been doing over the last couple of objectives, right? Allocating costs to each job. So that should equal. And that's basically what this is showing you. And again, this is at the end of every month. You'll see that this does happen. All right, so here's your do it exercise for learning objective 3. We're looking at Stanley Company. They produce specialized safety devices. Here, they have estimated for the year that their manufacturing overhead costs are going to be $160,000 for the year. Now, in this case, they don't use a percentage of labor. They actually use something called machine hours. So the machines that are being used to create the products will be used for 40,000 hours. And so this amount of money is going to be allocated based on machine hours rather than allocated by percentage of labor, direct labor costs. They have job number 302 listed here that used 2,000 of those machine hours. And they ask you to say, what's the predetermined overhead rate for Stanley Company if they use machine hours to allocate overhead costs? Well, for some, this might be very obvious, right? You take the total amount of money that you expect to spend on overhead, which was the $160,000. You divide that by the amount of hours, machine hours, because that's how you're allocating it. So for every hour the machine is running, $4 is going to be allocated to the overhead. So job number 302 used 2,000 machine hours, which means that at $4 per hour, the predetermined overhead rate for Stanley will be $8,000. So $8,000 represents the amount of manufacturing overhead costs allocated to job number 302, okay? Because they used it based on machine hours. So you break it down into the amount per hour, multiply that by the number of hours the machines were used to produce the job, boom, you got your overhead, okay? All right. The last thing it wants you to do is to actually prepare the journal entry. Ooh, you might remember this, right? So in this case here, we are allocating money from our manufacturing overhead costs, right, to work in process inventory. So because we spent $8,000, we calculated $8,000 in manufacturing costs. We're going to debit our work in process inventory by $8,000 to show we've moved it to work in process inventory. Now we're going to lower our manufacturing overhead with a credit to that account, showing it we have less. All right, I'm going to stop right there, take a quick break, come back to our class.